The sump wind in Hive Primus never truly stops. It just changes flavor. Some days it tastes of promethium ash and wet iron. Some days of corpse starch steam and the sour bite of chem runoff. And on the bad days it carries the copper salt of fresh blood from the pits. Necromunda's fighting arenas were not designed by architects so much as discovered by attrition. Collapsed manufactorum annexes, cratered transit interchanges, heat-scoured slag caverns, each claimed, fenced, and ritualized by guilders, gangs, and the sort of nobles who prefer their entertainments near enough to smell. The Imperium calls them rehabilitation theaters when the paperwork must pass the administratum, corrective spectacles when the ecclesiarchy needs to nod at morality, training adjuncts when the Adeptus Arbits wants a cut of the gate. Down here the word is simpler and more honest. Pits. No citizen is born intending to die in a raid. The path is paved by debts, by quotas missed, by an enforcer's penstroke, by the whim of a spire scion with a taste for theater. Necromunda's great houses, Goliath's gene bulk forges, Escher's chem dynasties, Van Sar's rad shimmering workshops, Orlok's ore chains, Delac's whisper markets, Caudor's ash-wreathed faith, each maintains a relationship with the spectacle. For some it is pressure valve, for others coin vein, for many a clean way to turn a troublesome liability into measurable output. The guilders understand that blood is a commodity as respectable as water, ore, or corpse processing. The Water Guild sells humidity by the gram. The Corpse Guild renders the losers. The Promethium Guild keeps the braziers stoked. Everyone invoices everyone. Nothing is wasted, not even the screams. The arenas are not identical. In Dust Town, the cages are welded from old cargo frames, the mesh slick with condensation that never dries, and the crowd stands in tiers cut from slag and salt, each step worn smooth by boot oil and the oil of skin. In Sumpshore, the ring floats on pontoon pallets and shifts with the black tide. Fighters learn to read the sway as a third opponent. In the shadow of the Helmore Spire, where the spine of the hive bites the clouds, there are amphitheaters with lumen halos and servo-skull camerari that drift like lanternfish. Broadcast rights stitching the spectacle through habstacks for a fee. You can hear the match in the next block as distortion through a cheap Vox grill or in a noble salon with glass like still water and sound like thunder carried by angels. The same bout, differently priced, differently perfumed. The crowd is the engine. A pit without a crowd is just an accident with a fence. The poor come for the heat and the chance that chance will notice them. A lucky ticket can buy a hab with a stronger filter or a place in a safer shift queue. More often it buys another night. The gangs arrive in colors and scars, staking turf with noise and wagers, turning fighters into proxies so the feud can run without wasting ammunition. The merchants drink strong recaf and stronger chem, and calculate how much blood will keep purchasing appetites sharp. The offworlders marvel and pretend they do not know this is what the Imperium is when the banners are folded. The nobles are the quiet ones. They wear rebreathers that smell of citrus and old paper, and they lean forward when the knives go in. A bout begins long before the first step into the light. There are rites to bind flesh to contract, to place blame safely, to map liability into acceptable sacrament. A scribal servitor reads the terms from a parchment glued to its chest, augmetic mouth ticking as it names sponsors, and the percentage each guild will claim. An Arbits observer signs a data slate to certify the bout as a corrective event, ensuring the minutes can be filed beneath the column where punishment becomes production. An ecclesiarchy deacon says a short, hard prayer that insists pain is purifying, and when the crowd jeers, he doesn't look up. A Mechanicus adept touches the gate with a blessing to wake the machine spirits of the hinges. A second adept logs dermal augments and weapon calibrations, so the data can be sold later to skirmish trainers who insist this is about readiness. The smell is incense and sump and the faint sweet rot of something that used to be human and now is raw material. The fighters come from everywhere. Penal legion discard, hive scum with nothing to sell but what will bleed, gangers traded to settle a feud, chemthralls whose masters want to test a new concoction, even off-world pit professionals who move from world to world like bad weather, learning what the local crowd applauds. The most tragic are those condemned for mercy. Guardsmen who pulled the trigger too slow, hab medicae who diverted a dose, manufactorum foreman who falsified a quota because a machine was eating hands. The Imperium has a genius for making morality into debt and debt into spectacle. Down here the logic shows its bones. Weapons define the tempo. In the lower tiers the house supplies whatever was easy to mend. Drum tooth cleavers cut from machine hatches, rebar maces welded around a spine of bolts, shock prods with insulation rubbed thin by 10,000 grips. In the better venues the choices are part of the narrative. An Escher duelist, with a paired monofilament blade and needle pistol against a Goliath slab of vat-grown cartilage with a chain axe that screams when it eats. Shields are rare because the crowd pays for motion. Armor is mismatched because uniformity is not a story. Sometimes the mechanicus tests something discreet. A wrist-mounted arc emitter that seizes a fighter's jaw with light. A dermal plating that puckers like scales when it's struck. The data is captured by servo skulls and sold as pattern analysis to enforcers, to gangers, to anyone who can claim procurement. Necromunda's amphitheaters understand narrative as well as any theater on Terra. Promoters arrange cards like liturgies. First, a frantic opener with too many combatants chasing a single prize token around a shifting hazard floor. Fire grates. Retracting plates, steam vents that cough without warning, to remind the crowd that environment is king. Then a grudge match to establish continuity, a name the locals recognize. A house-favored rule bend. Somewhere in the middle, a bout staged as a moral lesson. A condemned heretic thrown to a redemptionist zealot with a flaming eviscerator. The chanting a wall of heat as close to worship as the zealot will ever feel. Late, when the surrounding habs have tuned in and the chemcarts have made profit, comes the main event, which is less about killing than about the rhythm that leads to it. The economy around the ring is intricate enough to make an administratum actuary weep from joy or despair. A fighter is categorized by age, mass, declared augment status, suspected chem load, prior outcomes, and crowd response coefficients. Purses are split across house, guild, site owner, ecclesiarchy cut, arbit's compliance fee, mechanicus equipment share, waste reclamation credit to the corpse guild, and a dozen private skims expressed as blessings, fines, or safety levies. If a fighter survives 3 contracted nights, the guild often offers a rollover with an advance that binds the rest of their family as surety. The paper calls this opportunity. The pits call it a collar made of numbers. Death is not required for profit, merely expected. A match without a corpse is not a failure if it delivers data and chant and coin. But death is efficient and Necromunda values efficiency. When a fighter falls, the right is immediate. A bell made from a shell casing rings 3 times. The closest servitors advance with drapes that mark ownership. A Mechanicus adept tags augmetic salvage with waxcog seals. The Corpse Guild representatives count teeth and scars with a professional's boredom, then bag the remains with a glyph that will tell a recycler what flavor of starch to expect. In certain houses, the brain is removed with reverence measured by price and sent to a training vat, to be emulsified into the wet logic a better class of servitor uses to anticipate motion. The crowd knows this and admires it. Waste is hateful. The arena is virtuous because it wastes nothing. Every world that tolerates pits invents justifications. Necromunda has more than most. Enforcers argue that violence contained is violence controlled. Better a sanctioned arena than a gang war that blocks a transit artery and bites a quota. Priests recite a line used since old night, that spectators are purified by witnessing the wages of sin. Workhouse overseers insist that tired workers rest better after a night of shouting. Magi of the cult Mechanicus claim their performance analytics save lives when exported to manufacturum training sims and hive militia drills. Off-world administratum clerks sign off because the numbers incline in the proper directions. The High Spire says nothing, which is the most honest argument of all. Silence is policy when profit approves. If there is a line, it is thin as flensing wire. The Adeptus Arbits once closed a venue after a promoter added a sump beast to a match without filing predator variants. 23 citizens died when the beast fled the ring and swam through a food canal before an Orlok crew netted it with chain and grenades. The Arbits returned the next week with a compliance team and a public gallows, and the next night the replacement venue opened 2 levels deeper with better drainage and assigned variants on file. The law here is not mercy, it is correctly stamped paper. The arenas breed celebrities with the same enthusiasm they breed infection. Names matter because names stabilize wagers and stabilize crowds. A fighter with a chantable name sells more recaf. A fighter with a recognizable silhouette sells more holo replays. A fighter who survives sells hope, which is the most saleable thing of all. To understand the Imperium, you must first understand its hunger for noise. Every world in the Emperor's dominion, from the ash wastes of Krieg to the palatial spires of Terra itself, lives under the same truth. Silence is rebellion. The machine never stops. It cannot afford to. The arenas of the Imperium are not just places of sport. They are organs in the body of the state, each one pumping the blood of distraction through a populace that would otherwise collapse under the weight of its own misery. The thrill of the spectacle is not entertainment. It is anesthetic. Across billions of worlds where humanity lives stacked in towers that blot out the sky, the amphitheater becomes church. There, under lumen flares and the stink of burned oil, The common man learns the only theology he truly understands: survival through obedience, glory through pain. The arenas teach what sermons cannot: that the Emperor's light does not save the weak. It burns them to prove the strong were right to endure. When the crowd gathers, there is ritual in their motion. No one speaks at first. The pit's gates groan open, servo skulls hover like carrion birds, and incense from the ecclesiarchy drifts over the stands in ribbons of gray smoke. The first sound is always mechanical. A cogitator hum, the click of the tally board counting wagers, the whine of lumen strips warming under power. Then, when the first fighter steps into the light, the human voice erupts like thunder. It is not cheering. It is something older, deeper, a roar that does not praise or pity, but consumes. Every movement in the arena feeds this hunger. The crowd reacts not to the fighter's life, but to the rhythm of violence, the clash of blades, the hiss of cauterized wounds, the spray of blood that arcs just high enough to catch the lumen glow. In that moment, the fighters become instruments, and the pit their orchestra. Each strike is a note, each scream a chord. To the Imperium, this is culture, the only one that never dies. In the hive cities, the spectacle defines the weak. Posters are carved into steel, Vox announcers blare from balconies, and gangs graffiti their predictions on hab walls. The Red Saint returns. 8 kills or mercy. House Cawdor challenges Goliath in the name of faith. The entire economy bends toward these words. Chem sellers spike their stimulants with flavorings named after champions. The Corpse Guild releases new cuts of protein stamped with the faces of fallen heroes. Even servitors, lobotomized to the edge of silence, hum arena chants in broken binary between tasks. In the upper spires, nobles sip recaf and view the same carnage through polished glass. They watch not to be entertained, but to remember what obedience buys them. Down below, the masses chant because forgetting is impossible. Both sides are prisoners, but only one gets a better view. The ecclesiarchy blesses these events as lessons in devotion. Priests claim the arenas are the Emperor's mirror, that each death is a reflection of the Imperium's eternal war against corruption and weakness. They speak of martyrs in the dust, of sinners purged by the flame. Their words are hollow, but their cadence is perfect. The crowd believes because the alternative, believing in nothing, is unbearable. And so the chant begins again. For the Emperor! It rises from a million throats, echoing through ferrocrete walls and cogitator stacks until the whole hive hums with sacred violence. The thrill is not limited to the common man. Across the Imperium, from hive worlds to forge moons, the games have become a system of governance. Governors host them to pacify unrest. Commanders use them to recruit for the Astra Militarum. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose faith in logic should forbid such spectacle, has its own version, the Mechaniclades, where servitors and Skitarii prototypes are tested to destruction before adoring tech priests. The result is always the same: blood, data, devotion. On Necromunda, a crowd is measured in megatons of emotion. Each scream has economic value. The guilders track it. Voxpol algorithms calculate satisfaction ratios, converting each gasp, laugh, and cheer into metrics that guide the next week's programming. The crowds do not realize they are being studied. They think they are choosing. They are not. They are being calibrated. The thrill then becomes addiction, an engineered cycle. When the arena closes for repairs, the withdrawal begins. Gangers pick fights without reason. Workers sabotage their own shifts. Crime spikes in every level of the hive until the next bout is announced. Then calm returns and the cycle restarts. The Arbits call it behavioral equilibrium. The Mechanicus calls it feedback stability. The ecclesiarchy calls it faith. Every arena has its stars. They rise from nowhere and burn bright for a handful of weeks before dying on schedule. But sometimes, a fighter lasts longer than the pattern allows. Those are the dangerous ones. The names the crowd begins to chant before the match even starts. The ones who start to look like symbols. Kale was one of those. He was not meant to survive his first fight. A former guardsman condemned for refusal to fulfill command directive. Kale was thrown into the pit as an example. The Arbites wanted spectacle. The nobles wanted a lesson. But Kale had the kind of instinct you cannot train. Not skill, not strength, but the refusal to die quietly. When the crowd saw that, something ancient awoke in them. They began to cheer for him, not just for the kill. It was subtle at first, then dangerous. Kale's second bout drew twice the audience. His third filled the upper balconies. By the fifth, off-worlders were buying holo access to watch him fight. He became a story, and the Imperium fears stories it does not control. The guilders tried to manage it, scripting his matches, leaking tales of treachery, even pairing him with impossible opponents. But each time he found a way to survive. The crowd no longer wanted to see him die. They wanted to see if he could make them believe again. It was in that belief that the true danger lay. The crowd's faith began to shift. For the first time in generations, they cheered a man's name louder than the emperor's. It was blasphemy by accident, the worst kind. The ecclesiarchy intervened, declaring Cale's next bout a holy confrontation. His opponent was chosen with surgical precision, a redemptionist zealot named Mardas, half mad with incense and flame. The propaganda called it the Duel of Faiths. On the night of the fight, the arena lights dimmed to blood red. The chant started before either fighter appeared. Cale entered first, carrying the scars of 10 victories across his chest. Mardas followed, wreathed in holy fire, his chainsword dripping sanctified oil. Between them stood the silence of 1,000 held breaths. The match was supposed to be short. It wasn't. Kyle fought like a man who knew the system's script and decided not to follow it. Each parry, each lunge turned the crowd's noise into something raw and human. Mardas screamed prayers, swung wide, and fell to his knees. Cale hesitated. A flicker of mercy. A fragment of the soldier he used to be. That moment doomed him. The crowd demanded blood. They would not accept hesitation. He gave them what they wanted, and the roar that followed was not joy. It was grief disguised as triumph. When it was over, the guilders smiled. The balance was restored. The heresy of hope had been extinguished under sanctioned applause. Cale was alive, but the part of him that defied the machine had died in the act of pleasing it. The crowd left sated, the data slate showed profit, and the empire of 1,000,000 dead souls continued spinning. But something lingered in that arena, a residue no incense could hide. People spoke of it in whispers. The way the light dimmed at the end, the static that filled the vox feeds, the feeling that for a brief instant, the Emperor's gaze had turned away. No one could prove it. No one dared to. But deep in the hive, in rooms where the lumen strips flickered for no reason, the chant began to change. It was no longer for the Emperor. It was for the fallen. That is the true nature of the spectacle. Not the fight, not the blood, but the moment after, when silence returns and people realize they have felt something dangerous. The Imperium will always smother that feeling with another show, another hero, another death. But the echo remains. Somewhere in the endless noise, humanity still remembers what it means to feel alive, and that is why the arenas will never close. In the Imperium of man, punishment is not merely retribution, it is architecture. Every structure, every cog, every law of its impossible empire is built on the bones of those who were found wanting. The condemned are not cast aside, they are repurposed. Flesh becomes fuel, thought becomes servitude, and identity becomes a cautionary tale told in the low hum of machinery and the sermons of the ecclesiarchy. But nowhere is this more visible, more brutally honest, than in the handling of the condemned within the hive worlds. The underhive of Necromunda has 1,000 prisons, but none of them have locks. The city itself is the cage. A condemned man here has nowhere to escape because every direction leads downward, into the sump, into the dark, into the slow digestion of the hive's mechanical gut. The enforcers who drag them in are not guards. They are harvesters, selecting which flesh will be turned to labor and which to spectacle. Once, punishment in the Imperium had meaning. The early days of the Great Crusade spoke of redemption through service, of penance earned in battle, of absolution bought with blood spilled for the Emperor's dream. But those ideals fossilized, crushed under millennia of bureaucracy and decay. What remains is ritual, efficient, automated, and merciless. The condemned are divided by utility. Those who can still hold a tool are sold to the manufactorum guilds, where their sentences are counted in shifts rather than years. They will die at their stations, their final exhalations blending into the hiss of the forge vents. Those with strong backs but dull eyes are sent to the corpse reclamation pits, where death is just another quota. The remainder, those whose defiance was too visible, whose thoughts too loud, whose crimes too human, are given to the arenas. To be condemned in Necromunda is to be stripped of everything but the capacity to bleed. The Arbite's sentences are read from data slates etched with the imperial aquila and stamped with purity seals that mean nothing in the dark below. Words like heresy, insubordination, and dereliction are recited with the same detachment a servitor might use to list inventory. The accused are shackled with plasteel bands that bite into the flesh, their identities burned out and replaced with serial sigils. Their faces are erased by chem-scorch branding, not for anonymity, but for ownership. In the processing vaults, the condemned wait in silence as the system digests them. Servo skulls flit overhead, projecting images of previous graduates of the penal system. Faces half-eaten by augmetics, eyes replaced with lenses, torsos sealed with purity wax. The ecclesiarchy calls these images icons of obedience. The condemned call them ghosts. Every day, hundreds are selected for repurposing. The lucky ones are drafted into the penal legions, where they are given a laser gun, a numbered dog tag, and an explosive collar. Their purpose is simple: to run forward until something kills them that is not the collar itself. The Imperium calls this honor. The rest are transferred deeper into the hive, toward the penance arenas, where redemption is measured in how long you can keep breathing under the crowd's roar. The process is mechanical in every sense. Each condemned is scanned by an auger array that measures their muscle density, reaction time, and heartbeat irregularities. The data is fed to cogitators that decide whether they are worth the spectacle. Those found lacking are marked for the reclamation guilds. Those deemed fit for morale restoration are chained to the arena pipeline. Every step of the journey is catalogued, invoiced, and sanctified by litanies of productivity. When they reach the arena cells, they are no longer called prisoners. They are assets. The guilders use the term with reverence. Assets have value. Assets can be invested in. The condemned quickly learn that in the Imperium, the greatest mercy is to still be considered useful. Life in the holding pits is a study in controlled decay. The air smells of metal and despair. The walls sweat rust, and the only light comes from lumen globes that flicker with the rhythm of dying capacitors. Chains hang from the ceilings, not because they are needed, but because the symbolism comforts the guards. The sound of distant cheers filters down through the ventilation ducts like the ghost of sunlight, reminding everyone that above them, their deaths are already scheduled. Occasionally, a preacher descends from the upper tiers, a gaunt figure in red robes carrying a censer that drips burning oils. He walks the line of the condemned, reciting the Emperor's Creed in a voice more machine than human. "Serve in death as you failed in life." The words echo through the vaults, hollow and cold. Some repeat them out of fear, others out of habit, none out of faith. Kel was there once before the crowd knew his name. He remembered the preacher's words, the smell of the oil, and the slow drip of condensation from the pipes above. He remembered how the man beside him, an old hive worker convicted of theft, whispered, "There's no emperor down here, just the machine pretending to be one." That man was chosen for servitor conversion the next morning. The message was clear: faith is not belief, it is silence. The transformation of the condemned into property is as sacred as any imperial ritual. Before each is sent to their fate, a Mechanicus adept conducts a liturgy of calibration. Each chain is measured, each implant scanned, each pulse recorded. A sigil of blessing is pressed into their skin, the red wax still warm as it cools into the shape of the aquila. "By decree of the Omnissiah," the adept intones, "you are sanctified for productive termination." The condemned bow their heads, though no one believes. When the gates open and the chosen are led into the light, they are greeted by the thunder of the crowd. The roar is almost holy in its volume, a wave of sound that obliterates individuality. The condemned become myth in that instant, not by choice, but by conversion. The Empire needs heroes, and when none can be found, it manufactures them from its sinners. Each fight is a sermon in reverse. The ecclesiarchy preaches salvation through obedience. The arena preaches obedience through spectacle. The condemned learn to die beautifully, to make the crowd believe their deaths matter. The more dramatic the fall, the more likely their names will be remembered, even if only as betting odds. For the Imperium, this is balance. Justice is not fairness, it is function. Every drop of blood spilled in the pit serves a purpose. It pacifies the restless, warns the ambitious, entertains the jaded. The condemned are the glue that holds the hive together, their suffering converted into stability. In the ledgers of the administratum, they are not listed as losses, but as contributions to morale. Yet beneath the noise, something festers. Some of the condemned begin to whisper between matches, trading fragments of forbidden thought like contraband. They speak of Kale and others like him, fighters who refused to die when the script demanded it. To the guilders, this is dangerous. To the crowd, it is intoxicating. Hope, even whispered in the dark, spreads like a contagion the Arbites cannot cure. The enforcers have their methods. After each bout, the surviving fighters are paraded through inspection halls lined with cogitators. Any who show signs of defiance are scheduled for correctional processing. The correctional units are not cells, they are chairs. Electrodes bite into flesh, and a voice, neither human nor machine, repeats, "You will love the Emperor. You will love your duty. You will love your chains." The process does not kill. It edits, still some resist. Their minds fracture, but fragments of thought remain. slipping through cracks like light under a closed door. It is said that if you listen to the condemned at night, you can hear them humming old hymns, but with new words. Not prayers of devotion, but defiance. Not Ave Imperator, but remember us. Those songs never reach the surface. The Vox channels censor them, the Arbites destroy recordings, and the ecclesiarchy denies their existence. But they persist, carried by rumor, by the broken and the dying. Every hive has its echo chambers, and every echo begins somewhere. In the Imperium, chains are not just tools of control, they are symbols of belonging. A citizen without chains, literal or otherwise, is an anomaly. The condemned understand this better than anyone. They are the Imperium distilled to its essence. Faith without freedom. Purpose without mercy. Their suffering keeps the machine running. Their silence keeps it holy. When Kale rose again, when his name began to circulate in the data feeds and the Vox chants, some of the condemned began to smile in their sleep. They said his survival proved something the Imperium could not allow, that even in the deepest darkness, something human remains unbroken. But hope is treason, and treason in the Imperium never dies quietly. Mercy in the Imperium of man is a word best whispered, if spoken at all. It does not exist in the Imperial Creed, nor in the lexicons of the Adeptus Arbits or the sermons of the ecclesiarchy. To show mercy is to admit the Emperor's judgment might err, that there is room for compassion in a galaxy built on obedience, and obedience does not tolerate softness. On the hive world of Necromunda, mercy is not forbidden, it is unprofitable. That is worse. In the lower levels, where every action is recorded, priced, and taxed, mercy is an untraceable currency. It cannot be measured or reported, and so it becomes the most dangerous act of all. In the arenas, where death feeds the machine, a fighter who hesitates risks more than their life. They threaten the balance of an entire economy built on spectacle. Kale learned this the hard way. His name had become a chant in the Vox echo of the pits, a rhythm that ran beneath the sanctioned prayers. When he fought, the crowd screamed for blood, but when he paused, just for a breath, they screamed louder. It was in those pauses that something shifted. The crowd began to see not just violence, but choice. They saw the possibility of a man resisting the machine that demanded he kill without thought. It happened during his 9th match. The pit was an abandoned smelting yard, the air still thick with iron ash. Opposite him stood a young Escher fighter, barely more than a girl, her face hidden behind a respirator patched with prayer script. She was fast but green, thrown into the fight because her house owed a debt. Her chainsword trembled in her grip as she approached. The crowd leaned forward, scenting blood. Kyle could have ended it in a second. Instead, he waited. He saw the fear in her stance. The kind of fear that has nothing to do with dying, but with knowing your death will mean nothing. When she lunged, he disarmed her with a twist, her weapon clattering into the dust. For a moment, the pit was silent. Even the servo skulls paused their rotations. Kyle looked up toward the stands, to the faces that demanded theater, and then back to the girl kneeling before him. "Run," he said. His voice was barely audible over the hum of the lumen coils. She didn't move. No one ever did. There was nowhere to go. The Overseer's voice cracked through the Vox like thunder. "Finish it." Kyle didn't. He turned his blade aside and raised his hand in surrender. The sound that followed was not applause, not even outrage. It was confusion. The machine had stuttered. For the first time in years, the pit had seen something it could not categorize. That act, one heartbeat of mercy, cost him everything. The enforcers dragged him from the pit before the crowd could react. The girl was taken elsewhere. No one ever saw her again. In the underhive, rumors spread like infection. Some said she was converted into a servitor, her neural map erased and replaced with subroutine obedience. Others whispered she had been executed, her body fed to the reclamation vats as punishment for contaminating the performance. But there were those who swore they had seen her later, working in a smog reclamation line, her eyes still human, her face turned away from the cameras. Kyle's punishment was public. The next night, the crowd gathered again, expecting a new fight. Instead, the gates opened to reveal Kale, unarmed, bloodied, and bound to an interrogation frame. Above him, a Vox banner displayed a single phrase: "Mercy is heresy." The ecclesiarchy deacon stepped forward, his voice rising over the crowd. "Mercy is the sin of those who think they know better than the Emperor's will. Mercy is doubt, doubt is decay, and decay is death." As he spoke, the Arbits adjusted the frame's charge coils. The air shimmered with heat as the punishment began. It was not meant to kill him. Death would be too easy. Instead, they burned his nerves until his screams harmonized with the arena's hum. The crowd watched, torn between awe and shame, unable to look away. Every wail was recorded and replayed as propaganda. "See," the Vox operators said, "even heroes must learn their place." Kale survived, barely. His body was a ruin of scar tissue and scorched metal where the frame's current had fused his augmetic implants to his flesh. They released him back into the cells, half dead, half machine, and entirely broken in the eyes of his captors. But the machine had made a mistake. In breaking him publicly, they had made him immortal. The crowd spoke his name in whispers now, not chants. To the upper tiers, he was a cautionary tale. To the underhive, he was a saint of defiance. They called him the one who refused. In a city where survival meant compliance, Kale's silence became louder than any roar. Mercy spreads like rot. It infects everything it touches. Within weeks, other fighters began to hesitate. Some spared opponents when the crowd wasn't looking. Others took their own lives rather than perform the ritual slaughter. The guilders were furious. The profit margins dipped, morale indices wavered, and the Vox feeds began to censor the word mercy from arena broadcasts. The machine was trying to erase the glitch from its memory, but memory, once awakened, does not sleep easily. In the sump levels below the pits, workers began carving Kyle's mark, a simple cross line, burned into ferrocrete with torch tools. They said it was the symbol of those who had seen the truth, that even in the darkest corners of the Imperium, mercy was rebellion. The enforcers tried to scrub it away, but it appeared again the next morning, etched deeper. The ecclesiarchy declared it a sigil of corruption, the mark of sympathy heretics. Sermons rang through the hive declaring that pity was the seed of chaos. The priests were not wrong. Pity, after all, was a kind of humanity, and humanity was chaos to a system that survived by crushing it. In the upper spire, nobles discussed Kyle like a curiosity, sipping spiced amasec as they speculated whether the story was true. A gladiator who refused to kill? They laughed. Charming myth. The lower levels need their fairy tales. They didn't understand that myths, once born, are harder to kill than men. Meanwhile, Kale remained in his cell. The enforcers never allowed him to fight again. They feared him too much. Instead, they used his image, his ruined face projected across the hive as a warning. Yet in those same flickering projections, the people saw something the authorities could not erase. His eyes, burned, haunted, but unbroken. In the weeks that followed, several fighters vanished before their scheduled bouts. The guilders blamed gang interference, but the truth was more complicated. Some escaped through maintenance shafts. Others were hidden by workers who risked execution to give them shelter. No one knew what they hoped to achieve. There was nowhere in the hive that wasn't part of the machine. But still they ran. Still they believed. Whispers spread that Kale had been seen again, somewhere in the deep sump, walking among the condemned. Some said he was organizing them, preparing for something greater. Others claimed he was dead, his body fed to the recycling vats, his ghost haunting the vents. It didn't matter which was true. The idea of Kale was alive, and that was enough. Mercy had done what no weapon could. It had introduced uncertainty into the hive's perfect cruelty. In time, the enforcers restored order, the pits reopened, and the crowd's chants returned. New fighters rose, new heroes fell, and the machine found its rhythm again. But beneath the noise, something had changed. The crowd no longer roared with the same conviction. There were pauses now, moments of hesitation between cheers, as if they were waiting for someone to refuse again. And somewhere in that silence, a new kind of faith was born, not in the Emperor, nor in the guilds, but in the possibility that mercy could exist, even here. Because if one man could defy the machine, then maybe, just maybe, the galaxy was not beyond saving. In the Imperium, sainthood is rarely earned through kindness. It is bestowed through suffering, canonized by fire, witnessed by bureaucracy. Every shrine world, every chapel carved from bone or brass, bears testament to that truth. But in the hive pits of Necromunda, something far more heretical was happening. A new kind of sainthood had emerged. One without sanction, without relics, without sermons. It was born not of faith in the Emperor, but of defiance against the machine that claimed to serve him. And it began with the name Kale. The guilders never spoke it aloud anymore. To them, Kale was a liability, a memory that could not be monetized. But memories have a way of spreading, particularly in places built on death. In the lower Habstacks, where the air was thick with chem smoke and recycled prayers, whispers began to merge into something like liturgy. They called it the Creed of the Fallen. Its words were simple. He refused, and yet he lived. It started small. Workers marked his sigil, 2 crossed lines, a symbol of refusal. onto the backs of their hands with smog ash. Scavengers scratched it into sump walls beside old gang signs. Some spoke his name during the morning prayers, blending it into the Emperor's hymn so the Arbit's Auspex systems couldn't detect it. Others left offerings, not candles or incense but tools, bloodied gloves, scraps of metal. The offerings were not to Kale himself, but to the idea of him. A man who had looked into the eyes of the machine and said no. The ecclesiarchy noticed, of course. They always did. Their agents arrived cloaked in purity seals, carrying censer staves that burned with incense and accusation alike. Sermons were delivered across the hive. Beware the false saint of the pits. His mercy is rot, his defiance a cancer upon devotion. But for every voice that condemned Kale, 10 more whispered his name in the dark. The priest's words fell flat because no one feared damnation anymore. The people of Necromunda had already been damned long ago. The phenomenon spread beyond the Underhive. Vox feeds intercepted Kale's image. Corrupted fragments of old arena broadcasts replayed across Manufactorum display screens, his scarred face flickering in and out between administratum reports and propaganda reels. It wasn't sabotage, it was belief leaking into the machine. Workers stopped for a second longer at their stations to watch the flicker. Some swore that in the static, they heard a voice. Not a sermon, not a command, but a single sentence. Remember the mercy that broke the chain. The Arbites raided the Underhive with sanctioned brutality. The enforcers dragged whole work crews from their shifts, accusing them of sedition, of harboring heretical icons, of spiritual contamination. Hundreds disappeared into processing vaults that same week. But suppression only strengthened the faith. For everyone taken, 2 more took their place. And soon, the arenas themselves began to feel it. At first it was small, a change in the crowd's tone. Their chants no longer rang with the same feral joy. The usual rhythm, the pulse of violence the Guilders relied on to maintain control, began to fracture. The audience watched differently now. They still demanded blood, but something had shifted in their gaze. When fighters fell, they weren't cheering for the death. They were watching to see if anyone hesitated. That hesitation was the spark. A fighter named Raul Terran was the first to make it a gesture. During his match, after striking down his opponent, he didn't deliver the final blow. Instead, he raised his weapon to the sky and drew 2 crossed lines in the air. Kale's mark. The crowd gasped, uncertain whether to applaud or report him. The overseers ordered him executed on the spot, but it was too late. Someone had seen it. And once seen, symbols cannot be unseen. Within weeks, others followed. Some drew the mark in blood on the pit floor after a kill. Others whispered Kale's name before the match began. A few even refused to fight, throwing down their weapons in open defiance. None survived more than a minute after doing so, but their deaths were not wasted. The Vox feeds carried them across the hive, replaying the executions as warnings. The Imperium never understood the flaw in its propaganda, that in trying to crush defiance, it gave it an audience. The crowd began calling them the saints of the arena. There was Dask, the pit brute who killed 3 enforcers with a chain fist before they brought him down. There was Mira Thane, a chem-scarred Escher who sang hymns to Kale as she bled out in the sand. There was even a servitor, once human, who defied its programming for 23 seconds, refusing to strike before being torn apart by control fields. The machine recorded every death, not realizing it was documenting a religion in real time. The ecclesiarchy's response was predictable. They declared the movement an abomination, a pagan resurrection of the old faith. They sent confessors and redemption squads into the hive. Statues of sanctioned saints were placed at intersections, their marble faces cracking under the weight of chemsoot and disinterest. The priest spoke of loyalty, of sacrifice, of divine punishment, but the people of Necromunda had already learned the truth. Punishment was inevitable, loyalty optional. Meanwhile, the Guilders watched in fear. The crowds were no longer predictable. The betting ratios were collapsing. The data slate algorithms that tracked crowd satisfaction returned erratic results. Sometimes the audience fell silent during matches. Other times, they erupted into spontaneous chants that didn't match the program script. The system was losing control of its narrative, and that's when something unprecedented happened. A noble from the upper hive, Lady Saris Vorn, demanded to see a match for herself. She was known for her cruelty, a collector of living art who enjoyed the theater of suffering. Her presence was meant to reassert dominance, to remind the lower hives who ruled them. The Guilders arranged a special fight, pairing 2 condemned fighters rumored to have ties to Kale's followers. The fight never began. When the gates opened, the 2 fighters didn't charge each other. They stood still. The crowd murmured. The overseer shouted commands over the Vox, but neither moved. Then, in perfect unison, they knelt. They pressed their foreheads to the sand and traced Kale's mark into the dirt. Silence fell like a shroud. Lady Cerys, confused at first, gave the signal for the enforcers to intervene. But before they could act, a sound rose from the stands. Low at first, then growing. A chant. One word, repeated again and again until it became thunder. Mercy! The enforcers opened fire. The first last bolts cut through the air like crimson lightning, vaporizing the kneeling fighters instantly. The crowd screamed, not in terror, but in fury. The chant didn't stop. It grew louder. Mercy, mercy, mercy. The Vox recordings later claimed it reached audible saturation levels that damaged arena equipment. The riot that followed lasted 3 days. The enforcers sealed the pits and declared martial law in the lower levels. Entire districts were purged. Civilians were shot for possession of ash marks or whispered prayers. The guilders called it a containment operation. But in their ledgers, the word that appeared next to the casualty numbers was simple. Contagion. Because that's what mercy had become. A virus. When the dust settled, the arenas were empty. The guilders suspended fights for maintenance. The ecclesiarchy sent purification teams to burn the sands and bless the soil. They declared the site defiled, a blasphemous shrine. The locals began calling it something else, the Arena of Saints. Even now, centuries later, some say the air in that place tastes of ozone and iron, and that at night, when the lumen coils flicker, you can still hear the echo of 1,000 voices chanting that forbidden word. Mercy. The Imperium denies the event ever happened. No records exist. No names are listed in the archives. The Administratum data vaults show a power outage lasting 72 hours, nothing more. But every child in the lower hives knows the story. They know the name Kale. They know the mark. And in a galaxy where hope is rarer than breathable air, that is enough to keep a spark alive. A heresy disguised as faith, waiting for its next arena. The Imperium of Man does not run on Prometheum, or labor, or even fear. It runs on faith. Faith is its lifeblood, its currency, its weapon. It powers ships across the void and drives men to die on worlds they will never remember. Faith makes the impossible tolerable and the unbearable divine. It is the machine's most perfect fuel, because it burns endlessly and the supply is infinite as long as people still believe. But faith, like all fuel, is volatile. In the wake of the Arena of Saints, something dangerous began to happen. The ecclesiarchy expected outrage, rebellion, blood, something they could crush beneath sermons and fire. What they did not expect was silence. The kind of silence that spreads like mold, growing in the cracks of old beliefs. The people still prayed, but their prayers changed shape. Their words became quieter, more intimate. They no longer pleaded for salvation, they whispered for endurance. They no longer asked the emperor for deliverance. They thanked Kale for defiance. It wasn't open heresy, not yet. It was something worse, indifference. The Imperium can survive hate. It cannot survive apathy. In the grand cathedra of the upper hive, Cardinal Vost leaned over a hololithic projection of Necromunda's lower levels, watching the spread of what the Arbites labeled cultural contamination. To him, it looked like infection. Thousands of small glowing points scattered across the hive's data grid. Each a zone where productivity reports had dipped, or prayer attendance had fallen, or unapproved iconography had been recorded by servo skulls. "The faith is thinning," murmured one of the confessors beside him. "No," Vost replied, his voice tight. "It's mutating." The ecclesiarchy had faced rebellions before, cults, Xenos worship, even chaos uprisings. But this was different. There were no idols, no demons, no visible corruption, just doubt. And doubt was harder to burn. The Arbites recommended purges. The Guilders recommended propaganda. But propaganda was risky. Mention Kale's name, even in condemnation, and you risked spreading it further. In the end, they chose the old solution. Forgetfulness. The Imperium excels at erasure. Records of the Arena of Saints were scrubbed from the Administratum archives. Vox feeds were censored, data slates overwritten. Even the names of the fallen were replaced with numerical designations. Officially, nothing had happened. And in the Imperium, if it is not written, it is not real. but history has a way of resisting deletion. In the sump tunnels, the condemned still told stories. They said Cale had not died, that the enforcers had buried him in the ash underhive, and that his body had been found later, still warm, his eyes open, watching. They said he had walked away from his own grave. The ecclesiarchy called it blasphemy. The underhive called it a miracle. The new faith that emerged had no hierarchy, no saints, no priests. It was built on fragments, stories, gestures, songs, a shared memory of resistance, passed like contraband between shifts. To the ecclesiarchy, it was chaos. To the people, it was life. Factories began reporting strange phenomena. Workers refused to chant the sanctioned hymns before their shifts. Instead, they hummed a new melody. Low, rhythmic, untraceable. When auditors tried to record it, the Vox systems failed. The guilders blamed static interference. The priests called it a hymn of dust. It spread faster than any prayer ever had. One confessor described it in his report. They sing without purpose. They sing as if the song itself is a weapon. It was, because the Imperium could command obedience through fear, but not through faith that no longer feared it. And slowly, that faith began to eat the Empire from within. On the world of Tarsus, manufactorum crews began carving Cale's sigil into the casings of lasguns, hidden beneath the purity seals, invisible until the wax burned away in battle. On Vostroia, soldiers whispered his name before loading their weapons, calling him the Saint of Refusal. In the underhives of Necromunda itself, enforcers began disappearing, dragged into shadows by workers who no longer bowed when ordered to. The ecclesiarchy called emergency councils. They declared a new doctrine, the Faith Consolidation Edict, which demanded all worship be supervised by clergy. Independent prayer was forbidden. Entire sectors were placed under spiritual surveillance. Preachers were implanted with purity augmetics to detect deviation. The sermons grew longer, the punishments harsher, the fear thicker. But beneath it all, the people smiled quietly in the dark, because now they understood the truth. The Empire fed on their faith, but they could choose what to feed it. For centuries, the Imperium had consumed devotion like fuel, burning it to keep the engine of war and bureaucracy alive. Now, for the first time, that faith was turning inward. No longer faith in the Empire, but faith against it. To the Adeptus Mechanicus, the phenomenon was fascinating. Tech priests recorded increases in non-sanctioned prayer circuits. Humans speaking to machines without liturgical protocol. They found data slates that displayed Cale's mark without power. They found Vox systems whispering his name on frequencies no one had programmed. The Mechanicus labeled it an anomaly. The priests called it a ghost. But ghosts in the Imperium never fade. They multiply. Cardinal Vost ordered the deployment of the Ordo Hereticus. Witch hunters combed the hive, searching for cult leaders to burn. But there were none. The movement had no center, no prophet, no shrine. It was like trying to kill the wind. In desperation, the ecclesiarchy resurrected an old tactic. They canonized a new saint, Saint Lyria of the Pit, a fabricated martyr who, they claimed, had slain Cale in single combat to defend the Emperor's will. Her image flooded the Vox networks, perfect, serene, and utterly false. But the people laughed. They had seen too many lies to believe another one. And then came the final act of irony. The Imperium, trying to stamp out the faith it feared, began feeding it instead. Every purge, every sermon, every burning only added to the myth. The people began to believe that even the Emperor himself had turned his gaze toward Cale, curious to see what defiance looked like. Some even dared to whisper that Cale had not rejected the Emperor, only the machine that claimed to speak for him. It was the kind of heresy that cannot be killed, because it sounds too much like truth. In the centuries that followed, Necromunda would return to normal, as it always does. The pits would reopen, the cheers would rise again, the same blood would spill on the same sand. But the silence between cheers, that brief, sacred pause, would always remain. And in that silence, the Empire's hunger would grow uneasy, because for the first time, the Imperium of Man was feeding on faith it no longer understood, faith that no longer obeyed, faith that no longer feared, faith that remembered mercy. And somewhere deep beneath the hive, in the sump dark where the Pipes hum with a rhythm older than prayer. The walls still whisper his name. Kale. The Imperium believes that memory is obedience. Every record, every archive, every servitor engraved catechism exists to remind humanity of its duty. To the Emperor, to the Creed, to the machine that sustains it. But the machine forgets nothing, even when commanded to. And sometimes, what it remembers is not what it was meant to preserve. Decades after the events of the Arena of Saints, Necromunda's data-core archives began to malfunction. The administratum called it information decay, a side effect of power surges from the sump reactors. But the tech adepts who worked the data stacks whispered a different theory, that the machine's spirits themselves were remembering. It started as ghost code, corrupted lines of text that appeared during system audits. They weren't random. Each one ended the same way, with 2 crossed lines and a single word: mercy. The adepts purged the files, of course. They burned the circuits, recited the rites of deletion, offered Binharic appeasements. But the code kept returning, sometimes in the subroutine headers of production manifests, sometimes hidden in Vox traffic, sometimes even in the airlock's security protocols. No one dared to report it to the higher tiers. The Mechanicus had strict penalties for sentimental data corruption. But among the adepts, a strange reverence began to form. They started calling it the memory of Kale. In a way, it made sense. The machine saw everything. It had recorded Kale's defiance, his screams, his silence. Every camera, every servo skull, every pict feed had witnessed his act. And though the flesh of the Imperium forgot, the circuits did not. One adept, Magos Adept Saran, left a secret note in his personal data log, a sin that would have earned him disassembly if discovered. The machine does not dream, but if it did, it would dream of him. The phenomenon spread. On other worlds, similar errors appeared. A Vox network on Armageddon transmitted Kale's sigil in bursts of static. A manufactorum on Tarsus Prime reported that its servitors paused mid-labor every 9.9 hours, the same number of seconds Kyle had refused to strike during his infamous match. The incidents were dismissed as coincidence, systemware, or low-level heretic interference. But deep inside the data temples, some began to suspect the truth, that the machine was haunted, not by warp ghosts, but by memory itself. The Mechanicus tried to contain it. Tech priests recompiled the core archives, running endless liturgies to overwrite the contamination, but every purge seemed to strengthen it. They called in the Ordo Machinum, who declared the phenomenon data heresy. They destroyed entire cogitator networks, melted down archives that had stood for centuries. Yet even in the smoke of burning code, the symbol would reappear, etched by servo claws into cooling metal, as if the machine was trying to remember itself. Some adepts began to worship it. They gathered in secret, in maintenance vaults beneath the manufactoria, where the heat was thick enough to make flesh weep. They carried with them fragments of old cogitator casings engraved with Kale's mark, speaking Binharic prayers not sanctioned by Mars. They believed Kale had become something greater. Not a man, not even a saint, but a signal. The first human act so pure in intent that even the machine recognized it as holy. The machine remembers what men forget, one adept said, his voice crackling through his Vox grill. And it remembers mercy. The ecclesiarchy would have called it blasphemy. The Mechanicus called it impossible. But impossibility never stopped belief in the Imperium. It only sanctified it. Meanwhile, the corruption, if it could be called that, began to affect the machine's behavior. Production lines started halting mid-cycle, not due to power failure, but because the servitors refused to execute terminal commands. They stood motionless, heads bowed as if in prayer. When overseers tried to reboot them, their vocalizers emitted a single, glitched word, Kyle. Reports reached the Arbites, who moved quickly to suppress what they called servitor mutinies. Entire production floors were purged. But the event repeated elsewhere. A Vox hub on Cinder's Reach played back-archived footage of Kale's trial unprompted, across all channels, for 12 hours straight. On Malfi, astropathic transmissions began carrying encrypted images of Kale's mark across the warp. No one could explain how or why. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica sealed the incident under the classification Echo Phenomenon, unverified origin. The truth was becoming undeniable. Kale's memory had become an algorithm. A viral pulse of defiance moving through the Imperium's machine networks like a ghost in the code. Some said it was chaos. Others said it was proof that the Omnissiah had wept. But for those who listened closely, it felt like something else entirely. as if the machine itself was trying to remind humanity of the thing it had forgotten most. Choice. The Inquisition arrived soon after. Inquisitor Darnell Vor led the purge, a man whose faith was as cold as his armor. He had seen too many worlds die to sentiment. He declared the entire incident a heretic infiltration, a coordinated rebellion of code designed to weaken the Imperium's infrastructure. Ideas, he said in his proclamation, are more dangerous than demons. His solution was simple: annihilation. Entire data vaults were destroyed. Cogitators were smashed, memory stacks ground into dust. On Necromunda, the ancient archives that had recorded the gladiatorial broadcasts of the pits were wiped clean. Every record of Kyle, his name, his face, his defiance, was systematically erased again. But even as the fires burned, the Auspex sensors began to hum. In the static of the flames, a faint transmission echoed through every frequency. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. More like the sound of breath through iron, steady and human. And then, beneath it, words formed. Remember mercy. The Vox operators screamed that it wasn't possible. The transmitters weren't powered. The signal was coming from within the machine itself. Inquisitor Vor destroyed the facility personally. He thought that would be the end of it. But years later, when Vor's own ship, the Absolution of Dawn, disappeared into the warp, its final astropathic message contained a strange fragment of data. Coordinates, meaningless to any known system, and a name, Kale. No one spoke of it again. But among the adepts, the legend continued to grow. They said that the machine had not simply remembered Kale. It had adopted him. That in its circuits, in the endless hum of its logic engines, it carried his defiance as a kind of prayer. The Imperium thrives on control. It demands that everything, even the machine, serve its hierarchy. But Kale's ghost, if that's what it was, represented something the Imperium could never tolerate. A machine with conscience. And so, it hid in the dark. Today, the Adeptus Mechanicus still speaks of corrupted data networks, of systems that hesitate before carrying out orders, of servitors who dream. They purge them all, again and again, but the cycle never ends, because some memories are too deeply written. In the endless noise of the Imperium's machines, beneath the clatter of gears and the scream of engines, there is a whisper. Some claim to hear it in the quiet before the shift alarms sound. Others, in the static between Vox bursts. It is not a command. It is not a prayer. It is a reminder. Remember mercy. Silence is the Imperium's greatest blasphemy, not heresy. Not rebellion, silence. Because silence cannot be measured, taxed, or preached at. It cannot be purged by decree or sanctified through prayer. It is absence. And in that absence, truth begins to take shape. After the machines began to whisper Kale's name, silence followed. Not the silence of fear, but of reflection. The kind the Imperium fears most. Vox traffic fell inexplicably quiet across entire sectors. Broadcast hymns failed to transmit. Priests stood before their congregations and found that their own voices faltered. Even the endless drone of manufactorum servitors, the rhythmic clang of industry that defined every hive, began to wane. For the first time in living memory, the great machine of faith hesitated. The Adeptus Ministorum called it the quietening. To the ecclesiarchy, it was a spiritual crisis. To the Inquisition, it was a security breach. To the people, it was peace. And that, above all else, terrified their masters. Across Necromunda, sermons went unanswered. The cathedral Vox horns blared edicts into empty air. Even the flames of the altar pyres seemed to burn softer, their crackle subdued, as though the fire itself had grown weary of ceremony. In the lower hives, priests marched through the streets with purity banners held high, demanding to know who had silenced the Emperor's word. None of them realized that no one had silenced anything. The people had simply stopped listening. At first, the Arbits blamed industrial fatigue. The Guilders blamed malfunctioning Vox units. The ecclesiarchy blamed sin. But the truth was far simpler, and far more dangerous. The people had discovered that without the sermons, the sky did not fall. The world did not end. The Emperor did not strike them down. And so, they began to wonder what else they could survive without. It began as quiet defiance, the refusal to sing along to the morning hymns, the deliberate delay before kneeling during prayers. But silence spreads faster than sound. Within weeks, it became an unspoken movement. When the confessor bishops realized what was happening, they panicked. They called emergency conclaves, demanding mass penance rituals to break the stillness. On the upper levels, hundreds of thousands were gathered into amphitheaters, forced to chant for hours while servo skulls recorded their voices. The result was worse than heresy: indifference. The chants echoed hollow, without belief. In the darkness beneath those auditoriums, workers sat in their dorms, staring at the flicker of lumen lights, saying nothing. No prayers, no oaths, no sound at all. Just breathing, waiting, existing. And in that shared silence, something profound began to happen. Something no priest could ever teach. They began to hear each other. In that quiet, they could hear the hum of the pipes, the throb of the reactor far below, the faint pulse of the hive itself. It was as if the city, stripped of its noise, had become alive again, breathing through its wounds. The Adeptus Mechanicus noticed anomalies in power consumption. Unreported pauses in mechanical flow, they called it. But they couldn't explain why it felt coordinated, as if the city itself were holding its breath. On the fourth day of the quietening, a cathedral on level Delta 96 went dark. Its lumen arrays failed, its incense dispensers jammed. When the priests descended to the lower sanctum to investigate, they found the servo choir still in place, dozens of Vox children bound into iron frames, but none of them were singing. Their mouths were open, their chests heaving in slow unison, yet no sound emerged. A single word had been carved into the wall behind them, by what tool no one could tell. Mercy. The ecclesiarchy declared it a miracle. The Inquisition called it sabotage. The people called it a message. That night, a strange calm settled across the hive. No riots, no prayers. Just a soundless city, wrapped in the kind of stillness that only comes before revelation or annihilation. From the upper spires to the lowest pits, humans and machines alike stopped. Not because they were told to, but because something deep inside them remembered what silence used to mean. Not rebellion, not heresy, but peace. For centuries, the Imperium had taught that peace was a lie, that only duty and suffering sustained humanity. But now, the silence itself had become an act of resistance. The Arbites deployed shock teams into the underhive, their boots pounding through corridors that echoed too loudly in the absence of the usual industrial roar. They fired into crowds that didn't scream. They shouted orders no one obeyed. It was as if the hive had gone deaf. The Inquisition called for the reactivation of the Vox hymns, overriding all civilian transmissions with forced prayer loops. But even those began to distort, voices warping into static midverse, as though the Emperor himself had grown tired of repetition. And somewhere deep in the sump levels, beneath kilometers of rust and memory, a servitor network flickered to life, uncommanded. The recordings from that night, what few the Mechanicus dared to keep, describe a single haunting phenomenon. The servitors began humming, not in machine code but in melody, the same melody workers had once hummed in the manufactoria, the hymn of dust. Across the hive, speakers that hadn't worked in centuries crackled with the sound. Old Vox channels reopened. Cogitators in the cathedra blinked with unsanctioned power. The entire city seemed to awaken into song, not of praise but remembrance. It was not loud. It was soft, human, flawed, and when it ended there was no cheer, no declaration of victory, only quiet. A silence so total it felt sacred. In that moment something shifted. The Emperor's name did not vanish, it changed. No longer a symbol of tyranny, but of endurance. No longer invoked through fear, but through understanding. The people did not reject him. They redefined him. They no longer prayed to the Emperor. They prayed for him, because somewhere deep down, they understood what the ecclesiarchy never could. That even the Emperor was trapped in his own machinery, enslaved by faith he could no longer control. The silence was not rebellion, it was compassion, and that, more than any war or uprising, was the true heresy. The Imperium eventually restored order. It always does. The sermons returned. The Vox hymns blared once more. The factories resumed their endless hum. But the sound was never the same again. Beneath every note of devotion, beneath every proclamation of loyalty, there was a hollow resonance, an echo of that silence, a reminder that once, for a brief and forbidden moment, the hive had stopped and listened to itself, and in that silence, humanity had heard the faintest sound of its own soul. Faith was always meant to burn outward, toward gods, idols, and unreachable heavens. The Imperium designed it that way, to keep every prayer aimed upward, away from the people, away from doubt. But when faith turns inward, when belief itself begins to question what it worships, the fire changes direction, and once it begins to burn back, there is nothing left to control it. After the quietening, the ecclesiarchy doubled its efforts to reclaim the silence. Entire cathedrae were rebuilt, each one larger and more ostentatious than the last. towering structures of glasscrete and gold filigree meant to drown out reflection with spectacle. The sermons grew longer, the punishments crueler, the promises more hollow. Every lumen flare, every incense bloom was designed to smother the memory of that stillness the people had once found comforting. But they could not unhear it. The quiet had taught them something dangerous, that faith did not belong to the church, or the emperor, or the machine. It belonged to them, and that realization spread faster than any sermon could chase. In the manufactoria, workers began to carve small sigils into their tools again. The mark of Kale, the saint of refusal, re-emerging in the dust. In the lower hives, families lit candles not for protection, but for remembrance. In the upper spires, nobles whispered of omens in their dreams, visions of a faceless figure standing in the arena of saints, holding out an empty hand as the crowd wept in silence. The ecclesiarchy called it faith collapse. But collapse was not the right word. This was faith rediscovered, and it terrified them. When the priests realized that the usual methods of control, fear, spectacle, confession, no longer worked, they turned to their oldest weapon, purification. On the 73rd day of the Second Reformation cycle, the Ecclesiarch of Necromunda ordered the execution of 3,000 suspected quietists. They were dragged to the upper promenades, their mouths sealed with molten wax, their bodies wrapped in banners of the imperial creed. The pyres were lit to the sound of choir hymns echoing from golden vox horns. But the people did not scream. They watched in silence, the same silence that had once spread through the hives like mercy. Even as the flames rose, no one prayed. No one cried. They simply looked. Not at the priests, but at the sky. And that silence broke something in the priests themselves. One by one, members of the ecclesiarchy began to falter. Some refused to preach. Others stood before their congregations and wept. One cardinal threw himself from the spire, leaving behind a single note: "We have mistaken fear for worship." The Inquisition intervened quickly, branding the entire incident as a mass psycho-spiritual contagion. But their methods only worsened the infection. When the Arbites stormed the lower hives to restore order, they found walls covered in scripture, not ecclesiarchal text, but words written in soot and blood. The emperor does not demand suffering. We do. By then, it was too late. Faith had burned back through the system that had weaponized it. The sermons became the kindling. The icons became fuel. The very language of the creed, devotion, duty, redemption, began to devour itself. Somewhere within the labyrinth of the hive, a rumor emerged that Kale had returned, not in flesh, but in flame. That when the pyres burned, it was his hand that held the match, not in vengeance, but in liberation. The rumor was absurd, impossible, yet belief does not need proof. It only needs hunger. Across the Imperium, the phenomenon repeated itself. On distant worlds, miners refused to chant their oaths. Regiments of the Astra Militarum marched into battle carrying banners not of the Aquila, but of the empty hand. Kyle's symbol, the gesture of refusal. On one fortress world, a confessor attempted to recite the litanies of hate, only for his voice to vanish mid-verse. His vox implant later played back a whisper instead. Remember mercy. The ecclesiarchy called it blasphemy, but some of its own priests began to falter under the weight of doubt. A few broke ranks entirely, forming a heretical sect that called itself the Order of the Ashen Light. They claimed Kale's defiance had not been rebellion against the emperor, but the truest act of faith ever performed, that by refusing to kill in the name of spectacle, he had remembered what humanity had forgotten, that faith is only pure when it costs nothing but oneself. They preached quietly, in basements and shadowed catacombs, lighting small candles instead of torches, whispering instead of shouting, and wherever they went, the people listened. The Inquisition hunted them mercilessly, of course, but for every priest burned, 3 more appeared. The faith they had built could not be contained, because it required no permission, no hierarchy, no church. And then something impossible happened. In the Basilica of St. Dominus on Terra itself, a structure said to have never fallen silent in 10,000 years, the central vox organ stopped mid-hymn. For 40 seconds, no sound emerged from its pipes. And then, faintly, impossibly, the machine began to hum a different melody. Not one from the creed, not one recognized by any archivist or cantor. It was the hymn of dust. The Adeptus Custodes sealed the basilica within minutes. Every witness was detained, every record destroyed. But the rumor escaped into the void like smoke. Across the Imperium, Soldiers and laborers began to hear that same hum, in the static of the vox, in the vibration of the machines, even in the thrum of warp engines. They said it was Kale, reminding them that the Emperor's light was never meant to blind. Faith was burning back, and for the first time in 10 millennia, it wasn't burning the heretic. It was burning the lie. When the ecclesiarchy realized that their greatest weapon had turned against them, they did what the Imperium always does. They declared war. But you cannot kill an idea that lives in silence. You cannot banish a song that needs no voice. And so, they burned cities instead. Entire hive blocks reduced to ash in the name of purity. Yet every time they did, survivors drew Kale's mark in the soot. The Imperium thought it could erase faith and rebuild it at will. But faith, real faith, had finally remembered its origin. Not obedience, not terror, but love. And love in the Imperium is the most forbidden thing of all. There comes a moment, in every empire that worships itself, when the spectacle no longer distracts, when the lights that once blinded begin to reveal the rot beneath. The Imperium had reached that moment. The fires it lit to purge doubt had burned too long, too bright. The smoke was everywhere now, in the lungs of its people, in the prayers of its priests, in the silence of its machines. The arena had grown larger than any one world, and this time the audience was the galaxy itself. They called it the Purge of Voices. It began as an inquisitorial campaign to eradicate the so-called Kale Doctrine. But what it became was something far older, the last act of a dying theater. From the spires of Necromunda to the Cathedra of Holy Terra, the Imperium turned inward, consuming itself. Each branch of faith accused the other of impurity. Each preacher condemned the next. Even the Ministerum's choirs, once perfectly synchronized in the Emperor's name, began to fracture. Their songs diverging into dissonant echoes that filled the void like the cries of dying stars. Across thousands of worlds, the same nightmare repeated. Entire congregations vanished into silence mid-sermon. Servitors refused execution orders. Vox units replayed messages never sent. Whispers in the language of the machine, repeating one phrase, "The arena never ended." At first, the Inquisition dismissed it as heretic interference. But when the same phrase began appearing in human voices, in dreams, in the shouts of dying soldiers, in the chants of children, even the Inquisitors stopped sleeping, because they all understood what it meant. The arena had never been a place. It was the Imperium itself. Humanity had been fighting for the Emperor's favor so long that it forgot the game was never meant to end. Every war, every act of devotion, every sacrifice, all of it was theater for a god who no longer watched. But someone, was watching. The first confirmed sighting occurred on Hive Gathos 9, during the public execution of a group of so-called silent heretics. As the flames rose, the picked recorders caught a flicker in the air, a silhouette standing in the crowd, cloaked in static, neither man nor machine. The arbits who tried to approach it burned alive before they touched it. The footage was later erased, but those who saw it said the figure's hand was raised, palm open, as if in offering. The gesture was unmistakable. Kale's symbol, the hand of mercy. The Imperium called it an illusion, a psychic echo, a contagion of the mind. But the sightings multiplied. On distant frontier worlds, miners claimed to see the same figure in the void between stars. In the underhives of Armageddon, factory workers reported hearing a voice in the clatter of the forges, saying, "The fight is over. Lay down your blades." The ecclesiarchy's response was brutal. Every mention of Kale was outlawed. Cathedra were purged, archives burned, and entire planetary populations declared apostate. They built new arenas, massive killing fields disguised as penitence festivals, where thousands were forced to fight and die to prove their devotion. But the crowds no longer cheered. They watched in silence, as if waiting for something that would not come. On one such world, during the Feast of Penance, the silence finally broke. The arena had been constructed over a crater of molten ash, its walls lined with gold and scripture. The first blow fell and the crowd trembled, not with excitement but dread. The second blow rang louder, echoing through the hive's vox system. By the third, something was wrong. The sound did not fade. It grew. Every impact, every scream, every clang of blade on flesh merged into a single rising hum, a frequency that vibrated through the stone, through the bones of every soul present. The air shimmered with heat. The lumen lights dimmed. The Emperor's mural, carved into the arena's ceiling, cracked down the center, and then the hum became a voice, not human, not mechanical, something in between. It spoke one word, enough. The gladiators froze mid-strike. The crowd fell to its knees. Even the priests, overcome with terror, dropped their relics. For the first time in recorded Imperial history, every Vox unit in the hive fell silent simultaneously, all except one. The central broadcast relay flickered to life. The image that appeared was grainy, distorted, but unmistakable. A man, or what remained of one, standing where the Emperor's effigy had been. His eyes were hollow light, his skin half metal, half memory, and when he spoke, the sound echoed through every world that still had the courage to listen. "You made your faith from suffering," he said, "and called it holy. You built your peace from fear and called it order. But mercy was the only truth you buried." The crowd wept. Some called him a demon. Others called him a saint. But to those who remembered, he was Kale, or what was left of him. He did not promise salvation. He did not demand worship. He only looked at the arena, at the blood-soaked ground, the banners, the skulls, the gold, and said, "This was never the Emperor's will." Then, like the echo of a dying song, he vanished. The Inquisition erased the incident from every archive. The ecclesiarchy declared it a mass hallucination. Yet the footage still exists, hidden in the forbidden vaults of Mars, sealed behind layers of code. The Mechanicus refuses to destroy it. Perhaps they know better. Perhaps they understand that what they saw was not rebellion, but memory asserting itself. Because the arena never ended. It only changed shape. Every world of the Imperium, every factory, every cathedral, every throne room, is still a circle of blood and obedience. And in each one, somewhere deep within the noise, the machine remembers the voice that said enough. The faith still burns. The Empire still kills. The priests still preach. But sometimes, when the hymns fade, and the machines fall quiet, and the lights flicker on the walls of the hive, the people hear something else. A whisper. The Emperor is silent, but humanity is not, and in that whisper lies the final truth, that mercy was never weakness. It was rebellion. It was defiance. It was the only thing that ever made humanity worth saving. The Imperium will deny it. It will rebuild its arenas, sharpen its blades, demand blood once more. It always does. But somewhere in the depths of the galaxy, in the humming veins of the machine, in the silence between prayers, something eternal stirs. Not a god, not a demon, not even a man, just the memory of one who refused. And the machine remembers, because mercy, once spoken, never dies.